morning, good evening, or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. As introduced, my name is Quentin Van Diemen. I'm the Business Development Manager for AWS Identity and Directory Services. But please don't let that title scare you off. For the first 2.5 years of my time here at AWS, I was a member of our professional services team. And in that tenure, I went around to some of AWS's largest customers and really specialized in helping them with their approach to identity federation and identity and access management in general. And that's really the perspective that I'm talking to you from here today, is kind of the culmination of those experiences. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about federation for AWS. So during the course of our talk here today, I'm going to start off with a little bit of just kind of some grounding type material. Make sure we're all operating from a established base of knowledge around why we're interested in federation. A little bit of discussion on kind of what our various federation options are within AWS. And then we'll kind of get into kind of the nitty-gritty of it and look at how we get started, kind of the basic 101 of federation for AWS. And then probe more and more into some more advanced use cases and more advanced techniques. Along the way, we'll do a little bit of a discussion about a common question that I get is how to select an identity provider that's particularly well suited for AWS. And then we'll kind of close things out with a few just kind of tips from the field, a summary of a lot of those experiences that I had with those different AWS customers. Along the way, we're going to keep it kind of fun and interesting with a good number of demos. But I may end up going through the demos at a reasonably fast pace. So worry not. I'm at the end of our time here today. But before the Q&A, I'm going to leave you with some links to a federation-based workshop that we did at reInvent this past year that will go through everything I'm going to show you in the demos and then some in much greater detail. So if I'm going fast, don't worry about it. In addition to having access to these slides, you're going to have access to that webinar that'll go through, again, everything in much greater detail. And then please do, again, feel free to ask questions along the way. Moderators are going to help me out, and we'll save some time at the end for some direct live Q&A. So with that, let's kind of get started and get into it. All right, so first let's talk about kind of why we look at federation for AWS. And I usually break this conversation down into essentially 3 basic constituencies. The first are your users within your organization. And this one is probably the most self-evident of all of them. But in the world without federation, AWS becomes yet another unique credential form. And we all kind of know and understand the challenges that go around credential sprawl in the enterprise today. And so after federation, we're able to kind of bring AWS into the fold of single sign-on to where the credential there is just the same as is used elsewhere in the enterprise. So the next main constituency is, and no terrible surprise here either, is the security department. In the world before federation, in addition to usernames and passwords for the console, generally you're going to have other credential forms, things like access key, secret key pairs, and those perhaps being a little bit of a different type of credential than many developers and other users are accustomed to working with. Find funny ways of getting embedded in code and getting shared in ways that they really shouldn't. And those long-lived keys give the security department quite a lot to think about at night. And in the world with federation, we're able to eliminate those keys or greatly reduce their usage. And instead, we are able to offer our users short-term tokens that naturally expire after an hour, making kind of an automatic kind of self-destruct button on those credentials. So even if accidents do happen and those keys do leak out, at least the damage or the time window in which they can be compromised or exploited is naturally limited. And this really gives security department a lot of good comfort at night. And finally, there's the compliance department. Undoubtedly, for most of you all in your organizations, You've spent a lot of time and effort over the years to prove out your identity management processes. Things like onboarding and offboarding users, things like entitling users into different groups that provide them access or authorizations into different systems. And in a world without federation, AWS becomes bespoke from that. It becomes a one-off, mechanism, or one-off island in which we've got to replicate all of that process and tooling. And in the world with federation, because those on-prem systems or those sources of truth for your identity are unified with everything else in your enterprise, we get natural alignment. So when a user is offboarded in the corporate directory, their AWS permissions are naturally and instantaneously removed as well. So those three constituencies together really form the fundamentals of the rationale for why we look at federation. So now, as I mentioned towards the beginning, there are a number of different technologies and federation options that AWS supports. If we first look at a service like Amazon Cognito, that's a great service for providing essentially, federated access to the AWS APIs that are most commonly used as part of web and mobile applications. So Cognito in general offers a wide range of mobile and web-oriented services, but they have a strong federation component for those kind of end-user type experiences. Next in the queue, we have AWS Directory Service. And AWS Directory Service, and particularly the managed AD flavor of AWS Directory Service, has natural federation capabilities. These I generally refer to this as the Federation Easy button within AWS. It allows you to link up to your on-premise Active Directory and use username and password access to access the AWS Management Console. So if you have a relatively few number of AWS accounts and your usage is primarily oriented around the Management Console and not as much around the CLI or the APIs, AWS Directory Service can provide just a simple and straightforward way for you to get going with federation. Next, we kind of move up to what's going to be largely the focus of our talk here today, and that's AWS's SAML, or Security Assertion Markup Language integration. This integration has been around since, I think, about 2014, maybe even a bit before that, actually, if I think back in the history. And this is going to allow you to use your enterprise credentials for authentication and authorization into not only the AWS Management Console, but the CLI and API. And it also supports just a really fully featured and wide range of use cases that we're going to dive into today. And last, perhaps a pattern that's fallen a little bit out of favor more recently, but was much more popular a couple of years ago, is the notion of a custom federation broker. And this used to be quite popular in order to bridge in on-premise identity before some of these other AWS Federation options were available. There may be situations where you as customers might still have some of these custom federation brokers out there today. They certainly support a wide range of specialized use cases, particularly on the authorization side of things, but have generally been supplanted by some of these other AWS Federation options today. So if you're looking at federation for the first time, I'd encourage you to kind of focus more to the left half of the slide. Now, as I mentioned, what we're really going to drill into today is the SAML side of things, given that tends to be the lion's share of the applicability for large-scale AWS customers. Okay, so just as a quick SAML primer, let's go through. SAML as a subject is deep and complex, but just want to ground everybody in a few just basic concepts here, right? And so with SAML, you've got the notion of two distinct parties. You've got the notion of the identity provider, and that is infrastructure that's either that you've built and managed, or you're consuming from a third party like a partner solution like Okta or Ping or one of the many others out there in the space. And the identity provider is solely responsible for the authentication and the coarse-grained authorization of your users. On the flip side, you've got the service provider. And in this case, we're talking obviously about AWS. And AWS becomes the consumer of those identities as issued by the identity provider. The way this works in practice is that in advance of any actual communication, these two parties exchange metadata that describes, on one hand, the set of required attributes that need to be passed over, and on the other hand, describe things like encryption keys and SSL certificates that form the cryptographic basis of trust, such that this two-party relationship can be fully trusted by both parties. And then at login time, when the user actually wants to access AWS, what's passed from the identity provider to AWS is known as a SAML assertion. And that is the cryptographically signed message coming from the identity provider that asserts proof of the user's identity and passes over those aforementioned attributes that more fully describe the user. So that's kind of SAML in a nutshell. And again, there's certainly a lot more depth to SAML, but that should be sufficient for our conversation today. So now, as I mentioned, AWS's SAML integration has been around for quite a while. And there's a number of the parts of it that I generally qualify as kind of the known science. Things for, kind of how to do the basic 101 level federation, certainly how to achieve SSO for the console and other things. So this is pretty well known science, prior art. We're going to do a little bit of just solidification today, just to make sure, again, we're kind of starting from a common page. But the materials that I'm going to leave you with at the end will really, if you want to back up and study those basics and those fundamentals in greater depth, they'll enable you to do so. That said, there are still a good number of remaining challenges out there. And I usually bucket these into two broad categories. One is option overload, cases where there's more than one way to approach and solve a problem. And perhaps AWS in the past hasn't been as prescriptive as we should have been in helping you understand which option is either right for you or what the core decision criteria are. And we're going to go through a number of those today and see if we can get to that higher level of guidance. And then on the other hand, there's solutions that are around, but perhaps they're just not widely published. We haven't had a chance to get these out through blogs and official documentation. Excuse me. And we're going to go through a number of those today and see if we can get them more out of the minds of a few solution architects and professional services members here at AWS and more into the realm of the public eye. And again, so we're going to go through and look to extend this knowledge here today in our session, but certainly these materials are also referenced and will be available to you in the workshop materials that I'm going to leave you with at the end of today. So with that said, let's now go ahead and we'll transition to our first demo. And we're going to go through in that demo the initial SAML setup for AWS. Okay, and so as I go through the demos today, as you see me operating within Firefox, that is going to be my administrative view. And then I'm going to switch over to Chrome for kind of my user view, just to keep things isolated and separate. So within the AWS side, there's essentially two things that I need to initially configure to support SAML Federation. The first is an identity provider. So I'm going to go in, I'm in the IAM console, and I'm going to create a new identity provider. You can obviously see on the screen there that I've got a large number already configured by nature of the work that I do here at AWS. And that probably is worth pointing out that you can support many different identity providers in parallel, which is a great way to test and to try out new capabilities. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to select SAML as my provider type, and I'm going to give it an appropriate name. The last step I need to do here is upload that metadata document that we talked about before. This is a document that's usually published by your identity provider at a very known and fixed location. So I'm going to upload that, create that, and there we go. So we've got our SAML identity provider in place. From there, I'm going to go and I need to create a role for my users to assume as they come into AWS. So again, here I've got a number of roles already created based on my work here, but I'm going to create a new role. I'm going to create a role for identity provider access, web single sign-on for SAML providers. You can see that I need to properly select my SAML provider, although in this case it's chosen it for me. I see my trust policy document that references that both that identity provider and the fact that the SAML assertion needs to have the proper audience for AWS. I'll go ahead and I'm just going to attach a read-only policy in this case. And then I need to give it a reasonable name. And then I'm going to create that role. And that those two steps, so identity provider creation and role creation, are in the initial 101 version of the SAML integration, literally the only two things that I need to do. So now I'm going to switch over and I'm going to look more at my identity provider side. Now, in this case, just because it makes for a good example, I'm going to use Shibboleth, which is a common open source identity provider. But the techniques that I'm going to show you here today are easily translatable to just about any major identity provider that's out there in the market. So I'm not, certainly the premise of the demo today was that I already had my identity provider up and running. And what I'm going to focus in on are the AWS specific portions of things. So first, I would have configured what's known as a relying party, and that is the inverse of the metadata importation that I showed you a while ago. So that's not terribly interesting. So instead, I'm going to focus in on the SAML attributes that are required here. And I'd like to draw your attention to a couple right off the bat. We'll elaborate on a few of these others as we go through our time here today. The first, so AWS requires three basic SAML assertion attributes. The first, your identity provider probably sends to just about every integrated application already, and that's the name ID. The second one, and the first one that's really AWS specific, is the one I'm highlighting here, the AWS role session name. And this may well be the same source attribute that you use for name ID, but it will ultimately become the user ID that's captured in places like AWS CloudTrail logs. And so therefore, it's important that you set it to something like a username, a UID, an email address, something that is unique and non-reputable to the user. And you can see here in my example, I'm using the user ID. The next, and perhaps more interesting, is the AWS roles attribute. Now, the AWS roles attribute, if you go and you read the documentation, will specify that the identity provider needs to provide a comma delimited tuple that can be multi-valued, so a comma delimited pair that can be multi-valued, with one half of the pair being the ARN, or Amazon resource name, of the identity provider, and the other half being the Amazon resource name of the role in which the user is entitled to. And again, this is where the identity provider is asserting the coarse grain authorization from their side that AWS can know, trust, and use. And I guess what I'd like to point out to you here, and again, the details and all these specifics will be highlighted in the workshop materials, is that while we certainly could set that attribute to be statically defined, that would really present some scaling challenges. And what's much more state-of-the-art to do within the pattern that we use for most of our customers is to take group memberships of a known naming convention pattern. And in this example, you can see that I've named my groups as AWS-12 12-digit number for representing the account number, and then dash a word. And what I can do here is I can use regular expressions essentially to transform those group memberships into those two ARNs that I need. So if I just have the account number in two different places and then the role name in this second location, I can essentially dynamically generate this attribute value based on those Active Directory group memberships in a way that'll scale to any number of accounts and any number of roles without ever having to touch this identity provider configuration again.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a quick piece of feedback from the audience. Can you increase the text size?
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So I can, but I'm about to move off of it, so I apologize for that. And again, don't worry about the specifics in terms of being able to to see what's on the screen here. You'll get a much better feel for things when we show you the workshop materials. But apologies, I will certainly see if I can bump up the text size if I go back to the console. So now let's see how that actually looks in practice. So as mentioned, I'm going to come to my user view. I'm going to hit what's known as the IDP initiated login flow for my identity provider, specifying the AWS endpoint or relying party. And I'm going to get, as you'd expect, my identity provider login. So pay no mind, I put the AWS logo here at the top, but this is not an AWS login page. This is the login page for my identity provider. I'll go ahead and log in. And then while it's not terribly interesting, because here I just land within the AWS Management Console, kind of what happened under the hood is certainly the more interesting part. And that's where my identity provider authenticated me. It rolled up, it looked and inspected those group memberships, assembled the SAML assertion with the required attributes, and passed or forwarded that over to the AWS endpoint, which consumed it and then logged me in. So, so that's kind of the basic experience of the console flow. Now, as I mentioned, this integration also extends to the CLI and API as well. So for that, we've got, and here I will try to make this text size a bit bigger, although you'll have to bear with me. I'm using normally a Linux user at heart, and I'm kind of using Windows here today, and not as savvy with the keystrokes. So in the interest of time, I probably, unfortunately, don't know, none of my kind of standard tips are bumping up the text size, so I'm going to try to move on. But again, we'll be able to give you material so that you'll be able to try this out on your own. So for CLI and API access, we've published a number of blogs. They'll also be linked at the end here. But we have a little workstation side helper script. We enter kind of the same basic pattern. We enter our enterprise credentials. And a few self-signed certificate warnings aside, what this script has gone out and done is gone through the same SAML dance that I did using the browser, used an AWS API known as assume role with SAML, and fetched one of those temporary credential forms that I described earlier, and stashed it away in my credentials file. And then from here, I can use that temporary token, that 1 hour expiring token, to kind of use any CLI or API call that I might want, just by simply specifying a new profiler, the -- SAML by default. So that pattern is out there. It's been extended into lots of different languages and support for lots of more advanced features by lots of customers. But the basics are very well tested and should get you going well. So with that, let's kind of transition back to the slides, and we'll continue with the discussion. And apologies for my inability to properly operate Windows there. All right. So just as a quick recap, and again, these slides will be available for you at the end, but we started with a working SAML identity provider. We configured two things on the AWS side, the identity provider config and the initial role. And then on the IDP side, we configured a relying party, the SAML, the AWS specific attributes, and then we populated the groups according to that naming convention. Okay, so now let's talk and let's carry this a bit further. And let's talk about how we can scale this out, not just from one account, but to multiple AWS accounts. And there are two very common patterns that are used to accomplish this. The first is the direct federation everywhere model. And in that model, we're going to go through the same basic steps of configuring identity providers and roles within each of our many AWS accounts. And we're going to directly federate from the identity provider into each of those downstream accounts directly. This is normally accomplished with some trusted automation that may run in a central security account or other highly controlled environment that's going to push out a lot of those role definitions and identity provider configurations across the fleet of account using cross-account trust automation. And that's a pattern that's pretty common for all sorts of automation where we need to push one thing out from a centralized account. Now, the other pattern that's historically been used here is what I call the hub and spoke model or the jump account model. And in that pattern, we would have our end users use the SAML Federation bridge just to land in that first account, our jump account. And from there, they would use a different mechanism, the AWS cross-account trust or role switcher functionality, as it's sometimes called, to access, to move from that centralized account into any number of other different child accounts. So those are the two prevailing patterns. So, while neither is, either right or wrong, I would strongly suggest that you approach this problem with the direct federation model. And that is not because either one is invalid technically. In fact, they're both very valid technically, and they're both in wide use today. I would say that this is even very highly unsettled science within the AWS field perspective, even to this day. And so certainly that's why there's a lot of disparity of opinion out there. But having done this with a lot of AWS's largest customers, I'd really encourage you to look at the direct federation approach. And I say that, again, not because it's tremendously superior technically, but because I think it offers a number of very distinct, arguably non-technical advantages. The first one to highlight is that in the direct federation model, the corporate directory really becomes the sole source of truth for who has access to what. And it all ties back to those Active Directory groups or those other directory groups that we saw and talked about before. In the hub and spoke model or the jump model approach, your source of truth for who has access to what is both a combination of those group memberships as well as inspecting a lot of complex trust policy language within the cross-account trust mechanisms. And it's not that it can't be done, but for sake of ease of audit, attestation, and other things, it's just much more straightforward in practice generally to go with AD group memberships being the entirety of the course authorization approach. The second advantage that I normally highlight here is that in this model, users can easily have access to both a subset of accounts and they can have many or different roles within those accounts. And that's just purely because we've got the full set of permutations of accounts and roles outlined as those Active Directory groups in a way that we can be granular down to that level. Now, this certainly could be accomplished in the hub and spoke model as well. It would just really require a rather extreme number of AWS roles, perhaps even beyond what the limits of the service can support, or other kind of unnatural or anti-scaling patterns that just don't work particularly well. The third one, and one that I think is definitely overlooked quite a bit, is the end user experience, or sometimes what I'll call that day one developer experience. In the direct federation model, when a user, and we'll see this here in a demo in a second, when a user lands in the AWS console, having selected the account and the role in which they want to operate, they're off to the races. There's nothing further they need to do, and the first management console or CLI interface that they see is the one that they're ready to do their work with. And then that contrasts with the hub and spoke model, to where the user is going to land in a management console, but it's not going to be the right management console. And they need to find the role chooser functionality, which is a bit obscure if you're not familiar with it. They need to have a wiki or other reference where they can look up a lot of these Amazon resource names or ARNs for the remote roles. And it just adds a lot of friction into the experience, particularly for newer developers or folks who aren't quite as familiar with working with AWS. So, and then the last reason that I often give here is around CLI and API automation. If you're using the direct federation model, again, kind of using that pattern and that helper script that I showed a little while ago, there's no, aside from just selecting a different profile, the same automation that you would have used with a native IAM access key secret key pair will work with no modifications needed here. And that contrasts with the hub and spoke model, where every piece of the automation that's written in that way requires a cross-account trust role assumption as the first action that needs to do. So again, both of these patterns are entirely technically valid. They are both in very successful use through a number of organizations. Some organizations started with the hub and spoke, again, because AWS wasn't terribly prescriptive in the past about which one was superior. So don't fret if that's the world you're in, or don't feel as though you made a mistake. But think about how you might evolve towards the direct federation path in the future. And then on the other hand, if you're just getting started or you're not yet federating with AWS, and you're faced with either now or in the future a growing set of accounts and roles, or particularly accounts, think about this direct federation everywhere approach as your model. Okay, so let's see how this works in practice. So let's flip back over to the demo here. Okay, so now as I mentioned, in order to really scale this out, what we generally advocate for is, and you certainly could go and configure the items that I showed earlier account by account, but there'd be obvious scaling challenges with that. So instead, we usually look at assembling a package of trusted automation that's going to do this on our behalf. I'm going to show you some of an example of some trusted automation that I initially built for a reInvent breakout session a number of years ago, and have kind of continued to iterate on. It's not the prettiest or most polished approach. Certainly, there would be ways to do this in a much more advanced and sophisticated way, but this certainly is a good baseline to get started from. All right. So to do so, what I've kind of assembled here is a number of simple text files. The first of which just enumerates a set of accounts that I am interested in operating with. And I appreciate that text might be a little small, but all it's really showing is a set of 12-digit account numbers, and then what I call the role prefix, right? And that's just a naming convention that I want to put in front of my roles to make them easy for me to find. So you can see there, I've got 5 accounts in my file. And then the second thing I've got in here is another little text file that's just going to enumerate a number of simple or standardized role definitions. And in this, you can obviously see that those JSON files are also simple text files in the same directory. that represent the permission policies that I want to create. So I've got a framework here that describes the accounts, describes the roles, and describes the policies I want to attach to those roles. So with that in hand, let's go into our automation directory. And I have already established those aforementioned cross-account trust relationships between my different accounts. But I'm going to execute a first script here that is going to deploy my federation provider across all of my different accounts. Now, this is rather sensitive. This is a rather sensitive operation, being within the IAM space, and so I have MFA enabled this the script and require that in the associated policy. So I'm going to enter my value there. And what this script is going to do is it's going to go out to that known metadata retrieval point, pull in the XML, and then it's going to assume into each of my different accounts that were listed in that file and create a federation provider within that account. Next, I need to go and I need to do the same thing with the roles. So again, another Python script, all the source is available in the workshop. So I'm not going to bore you with looking at Python, but these are relatively simple script, 150 lines or so, including comments. And then we'll issue another MFA token. And you can see that it's going again into each one of those accounts, doing a cross-account trust assumption or cross-account role assumption, and then pushing in those standardized role definitions into each of my accounts. So now I've kind of replicated those same two steps I showed you in the first demo on the AWS side, but I've done it across a fleet of accounts without really too much pain on my effort. And as accounts grow or as role definitions change, I simply change the files in this directory. I rerun the automation, and my changes are subsequently pushed out. So now the last part of what I need to automate here is we talked before about how the authorizations to all of these accounts and roles are going to be controlled by Active Directory groups, or actually in this case, I'm going to be using Open LDAP, so LDAP-based groups. And I want a mechanism to create the associated, create and load the associated LDAP groups as well. And so I've created another simple script. If you're not familiar with LDAP, it uses what's known as an LDIF file to essentially programmatically load structure into the directory. And what you can see here is I've just got a simple script that compiles both a creation and a deletion LDIF file for each of my accounts for each of my roles. And then if I just load those in, what you can see here is, and this is probably the best example of the naming convention that I was describing earlier, you can see that all of my groups are named AWS-account number-role name. And so by placing my users now using any form of your on-premise workflow automation into these various groups, I can get the authorization sorted out. Now, I'm going to load a couple of group memberships in there, cooking show style. Again, because you all undoubtedly have kind of your own mechanisms for how you would populate group memberships in each of your own organizations. So I'm just going to load a few in just by default. And you can see here that what I've done is I've loaded one of my test users into seven different of those groups, all corresponding to different combinations of both account number and role name. So now at this point, the nice thing is that I don't have to touch the identity provider configuration at all. If you recall, that was why we took the time up front to build that regular expression pattern matching into our configuration. So it can stay just as it is and will automatically adapt to these new group memberships and new configurations out in AWS. So let's look at how that looks within the console. So I'm going to go ahead and get a clean browser session here. I'm going to come back to my my identity provider login page. I'm going to log in again using my enterprise credentials. And behind the scenes, again, the same dance has happened. And this time, I landed a new page. And this actually is what's known as the AWS role chooser page. And what you're seeing here is AWS took that SAML assertion from the identity provider, ripped it apart, and looked at all of those pairs of identity provider and role attribute values that the identity provider said my user was entitled for. And it's now presented them here for me in a simple, easy to choose list. And so I can go into any of these the environment that I want to operate in. I'm landed back into the console for both that account and that role directly. And then if I want to kind of switch my context or switch what I'm doing, all I need to do is hit that URL again. I'm still authenticated from the identity provider. I come back to the role chooser page again, and I can operate in any different environment, any different account. And then you can see here that, again, I've configured my user with both multiple roles per account so they can operate under the privilege set that they properly want to for the operation they're about to impart. And you can also see that not only is my user here entitled to a subset of the accounts that I have available, but they also have differing roles per account. And that's really helpful when you want to provide folks pretty broad and liberal access into perhaps your development environments, but you might want to have very constrained or read-only access into your more sensitive or production environments. Now, this same pattern works equally well for the CLI mechanisms that I showed you before. But to show you what that looks like, let's go back. Let's go back here once again. I'm going to rerun the same script that I ran before. I'm just going to log in as my slightly different user. In this case, you can see I've gone through the same experience again. And in this case, it just gives me a simple selection criteria where I get to pick the role and the account in which I want to operate in. And from there, again, no, the benefit is no cross-account trust required. I can simply issue, native AWS CLI commands to continue my work. Okay, so let's switch back to the slides, please. All right, so now just to recap, before I started that, I had a prerequisite of I already had the IAM roles for cross-account trust that enabled that trusted federation, that trusted automation to operate as it did. But then from there, I simply needed to put together two parts of AWS automation, one to push the identity provider across my different accounts, and then one to create and maintain a set of IAM roles and policies. The identity provider, we had nothing to do, thankfully, because we followed the regex pattern. And then finally, within the directory, be it Active Directory or Open LDAP, we automated the creation of groups. And that was it. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about how I choose an IDP that's right for me. This is a question I get a lot. And I usually first start off this discussion by saying that as long as the IDP can support those three required assertion attributes, it will work with AWS. Kind of point blank end statement. Just about any IDP on the market is going to be able to fit that. So it's not about will it work, it's more about will it work with some of the more advanced patterns. If you don't have anything to start from, I'd suggest a couple of self-directed questions. One, what are your needs for federation beyond AWS? Certainly SAML and OpenID Connect and others are used to federate into a wide range of SaaS applications. So think about what your needs are there. Think about if you want to host this yourself or whether you want to consume it in a SaaS model. And then think about what you have already in place today. You may well find that your organization already has this type of capability on hand. And even maybe if it's not the perfect fit the availability means you can get going quickly. And again, because multiple identity providers can exist in parallel, you can adapt over time. If you don't have anything that biases you one way or the other, I would strongly suggest that you look at an identity provider that can support the type of dynamic attributes that I showed before, because not all of them can, and that really is key to making your federation approach with AWS scale well. Okay, so now let's switch over for one last quick demo. And this is a question that I get a lot about how can I extend, or how can I do MFA style conditions in a SAML federated environment. And the backstory here, if you're not familiar, is that AWS's MFA, if you might be familiar with it, is exclusively applies to what we call native IAM or IAM users and groups, and it is not applicable to federated users. But instead, we certainly can achieve a similar type of integration. And again, all the specific details are going to be cataloged in the workshop. But to give you a quick feel for things, all I needed, or what I generally do, or I have already integrated an MFA solution with my my identity provider here. In this case, I'm going to be using Duo, but that's rather an arbitrary choice. And what I've configured is I've configured an extra SAML assertion attribute that is going to pass the principal authentication mechanism. So whether or not I use username and password, or whether I use two-factor. And it's going to pass that to AWS in a SAML assertion variable that AWS understands. And the one I generally use is the EDU person assurance attribute, which is an attribute that is plenty applicable for use in this way. And once I do that, that's really all I need to do on the identity provider side. If I come back and I look at the AWS side, and again, here I'm back in my my administration view, and I look at, say, this super user role, which is obviously a very powerful credential. The thing I need to do on the AWS side is I need to assert some extra conditions in my trust relationship. And what you can see here is the way this comes about is I specify that, again, I reference that same EDU person variable, or assertion attribute that you saw me configure a second ago. And I specify that for this role, the user must be authenticated with Duo in order to assume the role. So if we look at that from the user's perspective, if I come back and I find, let's find the session that I was just in. So this was the user I was operating with previously. They were only username and password authenticated. If I come back and I go to my IDP initiate login, and I select that role for which I apply the more advanced condition and try to sign in, you're going to see that I'm denied. Now, admittedly, it is not the most friendly of error messages. We're working on that, but with a little bit of user coaching, you can kind of condition folks to understand that that's the case and that's what's going on. So now, if I bump my authentication up to use Duo, I'm going to come back to my my identity provider. It's not going to challenge me again for my username and password since I've already been authenticated with that factor. But I'm going to send a little push here. I'm going to approve that on my phone. And now my identity provider, again, behind the scenes, has listed that more advanced authentication mechanism in my SAML assertion attribute. And if I go and I try to assume that powerful role, I now drop in just as I would have expected to. So let's flip back over to the slides, please. Okay, so let's finish this out so we can have a little bit of time for Q&A. And in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip the recap there. So let's quickly talk about some kind of pro tips that I've encountered working with lots of customers. I already kind of touched on this, but feel free to experiment. We can support lots of different federation setups in parallel. Make sure you really understand who has access to modify your group memberships. You're delegating that authorization to Active Directory, and so AWS is going to trust the result of those group memberships. So make sure you understand who within your organization can manipulate them for sake of privilege escalation concerns. I often say that consistency is the key to scale. It's much easier to push out standard and common policy definitions and modify the group memberships, not the other way around. And lastly, and probably the one that gives the most pain, is think through your tools and processes for assigning users into those groups, and particularly whether or not those mechanisms will scale. It doesn't do you much good to be able to provision identity providers and roles within AWS and all those groups into the backend directory in the matter of minutes if it still takes hours, days, or longer in order to integrate them with whatever workflow or entitlement management system you might be using. So at the end of the day, we need the end-to-end process in place such that users can request, be approved, and ultimately be granted membership into the groups that drive these authorizations. And then I think I've already touched on make sure you choose a good identifier for CloudTrail so that you've got persistent access. Okay, so I'm going to leave this slide up here as we go into the Q&A. The link at the top and the QR code on the side are both links to the Federation workshop materials we did this year at reInvent. And those will go, again, in great depth for everything that I've showed you here today. They're loaded full of CloudFormation templates and prepackaged automation that's going to give you a good working version, everything from getting started with either Shibboleth or ADFS 3.0 in terms of building up your identity provider, configuring it for the 101 case, and then taking you into a lot more use cases. I've also linked there a number of just the traditional AWS docs and security blog items that we commonly reference that a lot of this material is kind of building off of. So again, I'll leave that up, but with that in mind, let's go ahead and transition.